A few years ago, I decided I was pretty tired of just not being able to get good photos and good video with my phone. I was upping my Instagram game, I was starting to do some filmmaking, and the phone just wasn't cutting it for me. Now, the cameras on these phones have gotten a lot better since then, but they still, in my opinion, don't come close to a professional camera. So after some research, I decided it was time to buy a professional DSLR camera. At the time, a DSLR was pretty much it. But since then, mirrorless cameras have really come onto the market, and you might be asking yourself, is it worth it to get a DSLR in 2020, or should I go with the mirrorless? Here's some things to think about as you make that decision. First, let's talk about a few things that all of the cameras have, no matter if they're mirrorless or a DSLR. So first, let's just talk about what's in these cameras and why are they so big compared to the camera on my phone. First of all these cameras have an interchangeable lens system. You can attach a whole range of lenses and get a ton of different looks, a lot of different zoom options, and you still can just have the one camera body. Now inside of these cameras is a large sensor, and you actually can't see it right now because there's a mirror in front of the sensor on your DSLR. But there's a setting that allows you to lock your mirror up. So that right there, if you can see it, is the sensor on this camera. Typically, the larger the sensor is, the better the image that you're gonna get out of it. Now that's not always true, but in the instance with a phone, you're taking the entire image, everything you're seeing, you're trying to shoot it through a tiny lens onto a sensor that's no bigger than, say, your pinky nail. And you're just not gonna get a very crisp image when you're trying to take all of the visual data in front of you and put it onto a sensor that small. With a DSLR, whether it's a crop sensor like this one or a full frame sensor, you've got a lot more real estate on that sensor to capture all the detail, all of the crispness of everything that you would see through your lens. Another thing that you've got on these cameras right in front of the sensor is a shutter. Now the shutter opens and closes so the light is only hitting the sensor the amount of time that you want. It's not just always hitting that sensor. On the back of these cameras is a viewfinder, so you can see what you're seeing through the lens, as well as a screen so that you can see what's going on if you're recording video. And the other obvious thing that all these cameras have are these buttons, dials, knobs, things that you can adjust, which make it actually just easier to dial in an image quicker once you get used to where those functions are. So all of the things on these cameras help to be able to capture high quality images, whether they're photos or videos. So now let's talk about some of the differences. I'm gonna keep the lens cap closed on this thing for now, just so I don't get dust in there. With the DSLR, you actually have a mirror in front of your sensor and in front of the shutter. This mirror takes the image and bounces it up into another mirror and out through the viewfinder so that you can see what's coming in, and it's not digitally processed, it's literally you seeing what is coming through the lens. On a mirrorless camera, you're not gonna have that. What you're gonna see in your viewfinder is a digital viewfinder or electronic viewfinder, and that is just a little screen in there that's showing you the image after the sensor has processed it. Now, both mirrorless and DSLR will probably have this viewfinder. I think there's some smaller mirrorless cameras that don't have it anymore, so you just have to use the screen. But if it's got a viewfinder and it's a mirrorless camera, it's gonna be an electronic viewfinder. Whereas on a DSLR, it's an optical viewfinder, so you're actually seeing straight through the lens. Another difference typically in the DSLR versus mirrorless is just the size of them. DSLRs are bigger. They've got to have room for the mirror and the mechanism that flips it up and down. Typically they take larger batteries. A lot of times they have 2 card slots. This one has 2 card slots, whereas some of the mirrorless cameras only have 1 card slot. Most DSLRs, you can get a battery grip for it. It also has a shutter button on the top so you can shoot vertically. And a lot of mirrorlesses don't have that yet. And another difference, mirrorless cameras are gonna have a silent shooting mode where you can just take pictures without any shutter noise, whereas most DSLRs aren't gonna have that option, or they're gonna have a quiet mode, but it's still got a shutter that moves up and down in front of the sensor, and it'll make a little bit of noise. Now let's talk about some of the similarities. Both of these cameras, whether it's a DSLR or a mirrorless, like what I'm shooting on right now, they both capture through the same sensor for the most part. Now, with a newer camera, you might have a newer sensor, different megapixel count, but they're pretty much the same sensor when it comes down to it. I'm even gonna take a couple test photos that I'll show right here. One of them on a DSLR, one of them on a mirrorless. They're pretty much the same photo. You can't tell much of a difference. But if I were to take that same photo with my iPhone, you would see it's not nearly as visually appealing. it's a lower quality. Another similarity is that most of them are going to have a movie mode. When a DSLR is in movie mode, it's basically a mirrorless camera at that point. The mirror's locked up, you're getting the image onto the sensor, and that's what you're going to see on the display. So a DSLR in movie mode is basically just a mirrorless camera. Another similarity, and it's probably a common misconception, is that both mirrorless cameras and DSLRs have a shutter. The shutter doesn't have a mirror on it in the mirrorless camera. That's why it's called a mirrorless, but it still has a shutter that'll be closed. And when you fire off your shutter button, it opens, lets light hit the sensor, and then closes again. And then pretty much everything else is the same on these cameras. There might be different card slots depending on the camera that you choose. They're obviously going to have different buttons and functions, but they all pretty much have the same functions. You can adjust your shutter speed, your ISO, your aperture, and everything else is just user buttons that help you quickly get to different settings. So which one should you get in 2020? Mirrorless or DSLR? Here's some questions to consider so that you can better answer that question for yourself. What is the primary use for the camera? Are you going to be doing photography or videography? Now, both cameras can do photography and videography, but traditionally, DSLRs are going to be a little bit better when it comes to photography. Typically, DSLRs have a little bit better focusing system. They use a focusing lens rather than just contrast focusing. DSLRs can usually shoot a little bit faster as well, with the shutter being able to move quicker, and you get more frames per second in photo modes. Now, if you're mostly shooting videography, you might want to go the mirrorless route. A lot of camera companies are coming out with newer, better lenses, and they're putting them on their mirrorless cameras. Also, the new mirrorless cameras are typically a little bit more loaded up with video specs like 8K raw video, like the new Canon R5, or 120 frames per second video for slow motion. A lot of the DSLRs, they're not putting those specs in anymore. So you might want to lean a little bit more towards the mirrorless route if your focus is going to be video. Another question you might ask yourself is, are there any functions that one of the cameras has that the other one doesn't that I'm really going to need? Like that silent shooting mode, or faster focusing, or better video specs. Again, it's going to come down to your personal needs for this camera, because basically they can do the same thing. Does one of them fit a budget better than the other? Nowadays, you can get a pretty cheap DSLR or a high-end DSLR. You can also get some cheap mirrorless cameras all the way up to professional quality mirrorless. Another question you might ask is, does size matter? So which one do you think that you will get? I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. My opinion, the future is mirrorless. Yeah, I've still got my DSLR, but I'm shooting on a mirrorless, and I'm probably 90% of the time shooting mirrorless. Like I said earlier, most camera companies are developing new lenses for their mirrorless cameras. They're loading their new mirrorless cameras up with better specs, faster shooting video, faster frame rates for video, larger video sizes like 4K, 6K, 8K, and I don't think we're gonna see that stop anytime soon. DSLRs are just not quite keeping up nowadays. Now, for the professional sports photographer, wildlife photographer, they still might be using DSLRs for a while now, but I think most people are really going to be leaning towards mirrorless, and you're going to see a lot more mirrorless cameras in the next few years. Personally, I'm going to be using a mirrorless camera for my everyday photo and video camera. But for critical situations where I know I need to have a backup, the DSLR will be in my bag. Sometimes I need it for faster focusing or just for a second camera, so it's probably going to be in my bag for a while now, or until I get another mirrorless camera. I hope you liked this video. If you did and you wouldn't mind, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. This is my new studio. I'm going to be building it out in the next few weeks, so don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell notification, and we're going to do this together. I'll see you in the next one.